Okay, good evening, all. So we're discussing chapters 13 to 24. So we haven't got very far into the book, so I'll try and, whatever I say, I'll try not to anticipate and spoil the story for you. So, as usual, we start with a summary of what's happened in the last fortnight. In fact, I'll probably say a bit about the first few chapters as well, because Professor Marnick was concentrating on the cuts and the restoration of the original story, the original manuscript. So, so we'll start with a summary of the plot and then discuss a couple of points, which I hope you'll find interesting. And following on from the introduction earlier this month, I'd like to look at two cuts that Trollope made to his original manuscript in chapters 14 and 20, so that we can see how things change in the restored version. So now for the summary of what's happened so far. We left the Duke totally shattered by the death of his wife and apprehensive in his role as sole surviving parent to his children, especially Mary, who's just 19 years old, ready to come out in society and make a suitable match. His elder son, Silverbridge, has been expelled from Oxford for a student prank and is about to stand for Parliament. The younger son, Gerald, is starting at Trinity, Cambridge. His children had a wise and sympathetic counsellor in Lady Glencora, a role he finds impossible to fill. Any father would be worried in that situation. He feels generally isolated and friendless and unable to communicate with people without Glencora's help. And is still raw after his spell as Prime Minister in the coalition government, thin-skinned and withdrawn as ever, but still missing the thrill of being in harness. His problems become more challenging and will become even more so as we go through the book. His daughter has engaged herself to the son of a modest country squire, and a conservative to boot. His eldest son incurs debts, indulges in vices, and defects to the Conservative Party. Gerald is expelled from Cambridge for flouting college rules, so how will he cope? Frank is intelligent, ambitious, well-educated, but not a rich man. He's a staunch Tory, but has no profession. He met Mary abroad, got engaged to her with Glencora's approval without the knowledge of the Duke. Persuaded by Mrs. Finn, he asked the Duke for Mary's hand, which was refused. And the Duke blamed Mrs. Finn for Lady Glencora's doing. He ordered Mary to give him up. Mary accused him of cruelty and stood by her engagement. She promised not to communicate with Frank without her father's knowledge. Powerless to control her, he arranged for her to stay with Lady Cantrip in Richmond. Lady Cantrip made her own inquiries about Frank and sympathized with Mary. She disagreed with the Duke's objections, but promised that Frank wouldn't be allowed to visit Mary. However, she admits she can't control her actions or censor her letters, and so he left them. Now, Frank is in limbo. He needs a friend to advise him. Silverbridge disapproves of his courtship, and there's also been the recent coolness over Tifto. He's reluctant to ask Mabel because of their past feelings for one another. Mrs. Finn is sympathetic, but her first loyalty is to the Duke and his family. He writes to Mary at Lady Cantrip's, declaring his love and asking her if she's still of the same mind. He replies confirming that she is. So Lady Cantrip and the Duke see both letters. Lady Cantrip is convinced that Mary will win eventually and says so. The Duke begins to doubt her suitability for looking after his daughter and insists that Mary must be made to obey. Lady Cantrip suggests a more benign approach. Why not provide an alternative suitor? Give Mary time to get over Frank and then transfer her affections. Reluctantly, the Duke does some looking around and finds Lord Popplecourt. Rich, well-born, Oxford degree, no vices, perfect candidate. And so he wonders if Lady Cantrip will help him in his project to make Mary forget Frank and accept his choice. And we'll remember Mrs. Finn stayed on at Matching for a few days after the funeral and learnt of Mary's engagement to Frank. She persuaded Frank to speak to the Duke, but this resulted in her fall from grace. She wrote to the Duke justifying her actions, but he remained adamant. So she asked Mary to intercede. Mary promised to do her best and consulted Lady Cantrip, who also agreed the Duke was wrong in his judgment. Mary agreed to speak to her father. In the event the outcome is disappointing, Mary tells her father that Mrs. Finn only knew about her engagement to Frank well after the funeral and had lost no time in making him see the Duke. The Duke's still unconvinced and feels that she should have told him without a moment's delay. Mrs. Finn now starts to feel hurt and angry at what she feels is the Duke's injustice, dishonesty, and ingratitude. She doesn't want to involve Mr. Finn, very prudent, because Phineas will overreact to the detriment of his political career. She writes to the Duke again, protesting her ignorance, and roundly accuses him of being unjust in his accusation and assures him that she has no wish for a renewal of his friendship, only a simple acknowledgement that she has done nothing wrong. The Duke now starts feeling somewhat guilty and unsure of himself, but still obstinate, asks Lady Cantrip to arbitrate. She comes down on Mrs. Finn's side and tells the Duke she'd have done the same. So he writes a brief but unambiguous note of apology to Mrs. Finn. He doesn't want to see her or befriend her, but wishes he could discharge his family obligations in some other way. But she's satisfied with the apology, and her loyalty to the Duke and his family is restored. Then we met Mabel Grex, daughter of the impecunious Lord Grex, who, having squandered the family wealth, now lives for whist, gambling, and racing. He lives in Belgravia with his daughter Mabel and her companion chaperone, Miss Cassowary. Mabel is Frank's cousin and once considered marrying him, but decided against it on the grounds of common poverty. Frank made a quick recovery, got engaged to Mary, while Mabel was left with regrets. Now, Silverbridge, also a cousin, is attracted to Mabel, and she's half inclined to accept him if asked and be a loyal wife to him. In the meantime, Frank and Silverbridge both regard Mabel as friend and mentor. She's asked Frank about Silverbridge and his feelings for her and taken a keen interest in the progress of his suit with Mary. Frank and Lord Silverbridge discuss the girls as they go up to Silverbridge, the town of Silverbridge, to canvass for the election. Lord Silverbridge says the Duke will never agree to the match between Frank and Mary and might as well give it up. Frank declares he will and vows to stick to it as long as Mary's firm. And then Lord Silverbridge, on his side, expresses his admiration for Mabel. Frank agrees she's indeed a fine girl. And after his first day in Parliament, Silverbridge visits Mabel and tells her about his past idleness, follies, and new resolutions and hopes for the future. She offers sympathy and advice and is deeply moved by her interest, is about to propose, but she escapes to dress for dinner. She admits she did this from pity. He's a mere boy, should be spared, needs to grow up. Silverbridge comes again, sees her after the Derby, to tell her of his resolutions to reform and give up gambling and stick to politics. They talk about Mary and Frank, and she sings his praises enough to make Silverbridge jealous. They discuss love and marriage, and Mabel makes it clear that she cannot afford to marry a poor man. He proposes again, but she refuses him, makes a joke of it, and says he's too young and needs to concentrate on his politics for a while. Silverbridge, as he leaves, admires her even more, but feels that she treats him like a boy, not her equal. He tells himself that if she does take him, it may well be for his money. Then Lord Grex is short of money and complains about the expense of keeping the house. He orders Mabel to marry. She offers to give up her rights to the house, but insists on keeping her rights to marry as and when she chooses. And Silverbridge in politics. We left him about to stand for the town of Silverbridge as a Conservative, much to his father's disappointment. And the Duke was scornful of his son's recently acquired Tory beliefs, blamed Frank's influence for this, but was kind enough to acknowledge it was no crime and agreed to pay his son's election expenses. Silverbridge has to canvass for the election. He first asks Tifto to go with him, but has second thoughts, dismisses Tifto and takes Frank instead. That is going to have serious repercussions. They meet a few local worthies, Tories and Liberals, who welcome him and assure him of their support, but regret he's not standing as a Liberal, as his predecessors always did. And the prospective Liberal candidate has decided to withdraw in favour of the Duke's son. And so there's no opposition, so little canvassing is required, just a round of drinks at the local public house. He returns on the day of the election, missing the Newmarket races where his horse, the Coalition, is running. Duly elected, writes to his father with the news, and the Duke sends his congratulations and more advice about public service and humility. Silverbridge takes his oath in Parliament, supported by two senior Tories. We met Major Tifto, veteran of the Carlist War, and I guess from the dates it must have been the Third Carlist War, which was 1872 to 76. He knows all about horses and racing, is master of foxhounds of the Runnymede hunt because they can't find anybody better, and is a racing partner of Silverbridge and co-owner of the race horses, the Prime Minister and the Coalition. We left him at the Bear Garden with the usual suspects, Silverbridge, Dolly Longstaff, Lord Nidderdale and Graslow, boasting of his success with horses and women. Now, Tifto is annoyed with Lord Silverbridge over the electioneering episode, and then their shared horse, the Coalition, loses at Newmarket, and the betting loss of £400 is paid by Silverbridge. Tifto blames him for the loss, and he's angry about the election stuff and airs his grievances loudly at the Bear Garden. Frank and Dolly advise Silverbridge to drop Tifto, but that's infeasible, as their joint horse, the Prime Minister, is running in the Derby. Silverbridge is spending too much money, but the Duke instructs his agent to pay what's required to avoid moneylenders. The night before the Derby, there's a dinner at the Bear Garden with Dolly, Popplecourt and Tifto in attendance. Wine flows copiously, accompanied by heavy betting, the Prime Minister. The big day dawns. Gerald comes up from Cambridge, disobeying college regulations, planning to catch the last train home. All done that. Everything goes wrong. The horse loses. Tifto complains it's all unfair. Silverbridge loses £2,000, Gerald 200, and Dolly claims he's ruined. Dinner at the Bear Garden is late, and Gerald misses his train back. Silverbridge is repentant about the money, worried about his brother's future at Cambridge. He excuses himself from the rest of the Derby, letting Dolly drive his carriage with the rest of his party, again slighting Tifto. And over a solitary lunch, he decides to give up gambling and part with Tifto, and he'll stick to Parliament and marry Mabel. We've seen what success he had with Mabel. Gerald now. Having spent a year abroad, a gap year with his family, Gerald started at Cambridge after his mother's funeral, glad to escape from his father and the gloom at Matching. He now comes to London for the Derby, misses the last train back, and faces expulsion. Silverbridge pleads with the Master of Trinity, going right to the top, citing his father's undeserved sorrow, especially after his own failed academic career. The Master is sympathetic, but in the current political climate, cannot afford to bend the rules to oblige the son of a duke. Gerald's expelled. Silverbridge breaks the news to the Duke and is suitably penitent of his own transgressions and his part in Gerald's expulsion. The Duke is left to grieve alone, having no friend or confidant. However, he is touched by his son's remorse, which is some consolation. Right, the novel is supposed to be the last of a political series, but so far we've heard very little about politics, except for the flashback to the Duke's time as Prime Minister of the coalition government over a year ago, his sense of being a failure, and his longing to return to politics and government work. But we get a bit more in these chapters. The Conservative government of Lord Drummond and Sir Timothy Beeswax is thriving in blissful, unanimously approved inaction, while the Liberals, with their reforming zeal, are hopelessly divided. There's a rather amusing description of Sir Timothy. He views the Parliament as a talking shop, rather than a place for active government to improve the lives of the people. And he also regards his office as a means of rewarding his supporters with plum appointments in the church, law, armed forces, and nobility, as was common at the time. There's an extended discussion of the qualities required to be an effective parliamentary administrator and Sir Timothy's suitability for this. He works very hard to control his party and manage the House in the absence of any talented members like Pitt or Peel. The juniors in his party acknowledge his superiority, but the senior members in the Lords resent him and their sons in the Commons. And the latest election result has reduced their majority, and this is blamed on Sir Timothy's limitations. The Liberals have made a gain in the election and are relishing the prospect of returning to power soon. It is felt that the Duke must put his shoulder to the wheel again, but his colleagues are afraid to approach him. He's been rather withdrawn after he left office. His wife's death and children's problems have made him even more reticent. Finally, the Duke of St. Bungay, remember him? He writes to the young Duke, saying he's been asked to form a Liberal ministry. He recounts his 50 years in government after 5 years in the Lords, starting at the time of Lord Grey, which was 1830 to 1834. So 15 years would make it getting on to the 1880s, which I think doesn't quite add up, can't be. The novel was published in the 1870s. Anyway, he pleads his age and urges the younger Duke to forget his past unhappiness as Prime Minister, overcome his pride and diffidence, and offer services to the country. He assures him of the support of the rest of the party. The Duke of Omnium is unhappily reminded of the past, blames himself and then God for making him too thin-skinned and to do his job properly. But he is tempted. Being in harness appeals to him. So he writes to the Duke, thanking him, but still non-committal. Will he or won't he? We'll find out soon. Right. There are a couple of instances where Trollope made cuts to the original manuscript in order to satisfy Charlie Dickens Jr., who was editor of All the Year Round then. Dickens having died in 1870, Charlie Dickens' eldest son took over. But these cuts, he had to cut about a third of the manuscript, and these were restored in the 2015 extended version after a research project by Professor Amanek Tal. Okay, so the first bit of restored text, if you remember in chapter 14, where Frank says, I advise you not to take him to Silverbridge, that's Stifto, and Silverbridge replies, promptly snaps, you needn't preach. Now, which sounds that certainly sounds a bit abrupt, as there's no preaching here, and Frank was asked his opinion in the first place. But in the original version, Frank adds, the matter is important, and therefore I have no hesitation in saying that it would be a very foolish thing to do. Now, this is preaching, and now Silverbridge may well feel that Frank is going over the top. So the restored version makes more sense. The other instance that comes up in these chapters is chapter 20, has to do with Miss Cassowary. Lord Grex, in a bad temper after the Derby, tells Mabel that he cannot afford to maintain the family house. He wants her to get married and cease to be a burden on him. In the manuscript, Lord Grex says very nasty words about Miss Cassowary after complaining that their London house is too expensive, as if paying room and board for her is a major factor in his financial woes. Later in the chapter, Trollope deleted some of the conversation between Mabel and Miss Cass, describing how Miss Cassowary was prepared to go to Mrs. Montacute Jones's ball to act as chaperone for Mabel, but was glad to sleep instead. These details describe how much trouble she had thus taken in getting dressed, and how she had begun to strip herself of her finery, and this at the time that Mabel enters her bedroom, making further demands on her time. We see her position and the role she has in the household. Miss Cass, like many other impoverished spinsters of the time, had to take what she could in the way of work: unpaid companion, chaperone, confidante, dog's body, ever at the beck and call of her employers, subject to their whims and fancies, with no job security. Lord Grex is certainly getting value for his money. The Duke now, he's a mass of contradictions. He's a liberal by conviction, he claims, with a strong sense of public service, a desire to improve life for everyone, yet rigid in his views on the position of the aristocracy, committed to the preservation of the class structure, wealth, and privileges. His treatment of Mrs. Finn is regrettable. He's quick to blame her, despite knowing that Glencora was the one who encouraged the engagement. His refusal to face facts, even after they've been explained to him by Mrs. Finn and Mary. His reluctance to accept Lady Cantrip's advice, though he asked her opinion in the first place. He appears rather irrational at times and inconsistent with his professed belief in fairness and honesty. He's Trollope's favourite character, kind of self-portrait almost, judging from the autobiography. So it'd be interesting to know what you think of him. And then politics. This is supposed to be a political novel, but there's very little of politics so far. A brief mention of the past in the Silverbridge election, a bit about the reduced Conservative majority and the possible Liberal government soon. Without anticipating or spoiling the story, it seems to me that with a sense of pragmatism, Trollope might have cut out more of the political content than the other themes. We'll see in the coming chapters, but one is tempted to speculate. And finally, telling a story, Trollope's dilemma. Should the writer introduce the characters and set the scene before starting the narrative, that's the ab initio, or jump into the middle of the action in medias res and fill in the background as he goes along? This is discussed when he introduces the Grex family in chapter 9. The narrative begins with Mabel suddenly asking Silverbridge, and so poor Frank has been turned out of heaven. Then Trollope goes on to explain who Mabel is and fill in the background. But if you remember, we read Izzy, Pop and Joy a while ago, and there he adopted the ab initio approach, where all the scene setting and introduction of characters is done at the start of the novel, with suitable apologies for being long-winded. The question, which method do you think is most effective? Thank you.